There is a book, okay, it describes 72 demons. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, by name, by rank, by power. It tells you step by step exactly how to summon each one, and the church wanted this destroyed. They spent 600 years trying. They executed people for owning it, not practicing it, just owning it. What kind of book causes that reaction? One that works, or at least one that enough powerful people believed worked. But now, you can buy it on Amazon right now. 47 different editions. The Goetia, the book they couldn't kill. But the Vatican still has an active exorcism department, fully staffed, in 2026. And this book is why? This book is part of why. Today, we're opening it. The Goetia is part of a larger manuscript called the Lemegeton, sometimes called the Lesser Key of Solomon. It surfaces in published form in the 17th century, but the material inside, the names, the seals, the rituals, is much older. How much older? We'll get there. But the structure of the Goetia itself is straightforward. On the surface, it's a manual. It identifies 72 demonic entities. It describes each one in clinical detail, their rank, their appearance, what they can do for you, and the precise ritual process required to compel them to appear. Compel, not summon. That distinction matters enormously. The Goetia isn't a prayer book. It's not asking for anything. It's a system of control. The practitioner isn't a supplicant. They operate from a position of authority, using frameworks the book claims were established by Solomon himself, which is exactly why the church found it intolerable. The church's entire spiritual framework is built on God as intermediary. You approach the divine through Christ, through the saints, through authorized channels. The Goetia bypasses all of that. It claims a practitioner can access and direct spiritual forces directly by invoking the authority of one of the most powerful kings in the Old Testament. And Solomon is a shared figure. Torah, Bible, Quran. He's not fringe. He's central to 3 of the world's major religions. And this book claims he wrote it, that he didn't just receive wisdom from God, he also understood, cataloged, and systematically controlled the demonic hierarchy. The official religious response to that claim is obvious. Blasphemy, heresy, depending on the century, a death sentence. But here's what makes the church's specific reaction unusual. The Goetia wasn't dismissed as superstition. It wasn't treated as the delusions of peasants. It was handled as active, operational, dangerous information by people who had access to the most sophisticated knowledge of their age. You don't build an institutional suppression apparatus around a fairy tale. You build one around something you believe is real and is a threat. The burning, the executions, the centuries of systematic destruction, all of that tells you something about what the church actually believed was in that book. So who are the 72? They're organized like a military command structure, or a feudal court. The ranks include kings, dukes, marquises, earls, knights, and presidents. Each rank controls a specific number of legions, millions of entities, organized under 72 named commanders, and the first one listed, Baal. Rank, king. Commands 66 legions of spirits. Primary power, the ability to make the practitioner invisible or undetectable. And they get stranger from there. The 72 aren't described as evil in any crude sense. They're specialists. Marbas, rank president, 36 legions, causes disease and cures it. He's a physician and a plague vector simultaneously. Valifor is a duke who teaches mechanical arts but also the skills of theft. Laraje, a marquise, inflicts battle wounds and putrefies them, but can also heal them. These are technical domains, not moral categories. Exactly. Each entity has a specific jurisdiction, a domain of knowledge or influence over the physical world. And, critically, each one has a sigil, a geometric seal unique to that entity that functions as their identifier and the mechanism for compelling their presence. The ritual itself. Walk me through it. A circle of protection is drawn around the practitioner, inscribed with specific divine names. Outside the circle, the Triangle of Solomon. That's where the entity must appear and remain. The practitioner must wear Solomon's ring. Specific Latin incantations are spoken in sequence. And here's the crucial structural feature. The entity cannot enter the circle. The practitioner is protected by the divine names inscribed around them. This isn't worship. This is a contract with enforcement mechanisms, which is what makes it philosophically incompatible with any mainstream religious framework. The practitioner isn't submitting to these entities. They're commanding them. And this framework, the sigils, the hierarchy, the circle, where does it actually come from? That's where it gets very complicated very quickly. The 17th century manuscript didn't invent this system. Scholars who have spent careers on this material trace its components through medieval grimoires, through Greek magical papyri from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, and then further back into Mesopotamian magical traditions from 2000 BC. The same entities, separated by thousands of years. The same names appear across cultures that had no documented direct contact with each other. That's not folklore drift. That's a different kind of problem. By the 15th century, the Inquisition had specific protocols for dealing with texts like the Goetia. Specific, written down, enforced with lethal consistency. Not just the practitioners. Not just the practitioners. The books themselves were primary targets. The fear wasn't that someone would read it and be spiritually polluted. The fear was that the rituals described would produce actual results. Operational results. That's an extraordinary position for an institution to hold, even implicitly. The medieval and early modern church wasn't anti-magic because it didn't believe in magic. It was anti-magic because it believed in magic completely. The line it drew was between authorized spiritual contact, prayer, sacraments, approved saints, and unauthorized contact. The Goetia represented unauthorized contact with entities the Church classified as real and hostile to human souls. The 1484 Bull Pope Innocent VIII, the Summis Desiderantes Affectibus, explicitly identifying demonic magic as heresy punishable by death, not because it was fantasy, because it wasn't, which implies the Vatican had evidence, or believed it did. The Vatican's own records from Inquisition proceedings describe practitioners who provided specific information they couldn't otherwise have obtained. Intelligence from sources that don't exist in the physical world. The Inquisitors documented this because they needed to understand the mechanism, to shut it down more effectively. Yes, and the pattern extends into the modern period. Pope John Paul II, 2005, performed documented exorcisms. At least 3 confirmed cases. The Vatican updated its official rite of exorcism in 1999. A 2-century-old document, updated. New protocols added. You update a protocol when you're still dealing with the problem. The 1999 rite added language distinguishing between psychological pathology and genuine spiritual possession. It established clearer criteria for when to call an exorcist. That's not a theological exercise. That's operational guidance for an active department. An active department, the Vatican's Office for Exorcism and Prayer, still functioning, still receiving cases, still referring them to trained exorcists across Europe in 2026, and the entities those exorcists are dealing with. The classification system they use maps directly onto the hierarchy described in the Goetia. Not identical, but structurally consistent. The Vatican's framework for demonic entities, their ranks, their methods of operation, their response to specific formulas, echoes the Goetia's taxonomy in ways that are difficult to explain as coincidence, unless they're both drawing from the same source, which is exactly the question we need to ask. The Goetia's own answer to where this taxonomy comes from is King Solomon. The text claims to be his work, a record of 72 entities he identified, bound, and sealed after receiving divine authority to do so. And the Bible doesn't entirely contradict this. 1 Kings, chapter 11. Solomon's fall. The text describes him turning to the gods of Moab, of Ammon, of Sidon, entities explicitly named as spiritual forces, not just cultural symbols. Solomon knew these entities, engaged with them. The text says this interaction corrupted him, which means the wisest man in the ancient Near East had direct documented engagement with non-divine spiritual entities. And the Goetia claims that before this corruption, before his fall, Solomon had these 72 entities under his authority, that he bound them all in a brass vessel, a sealed bronze container, and threw it into a deep lake, presumably to prevent anyone else from accessing what was inside. What happened to it? According to the Goetia itself, Babylonian soldiers discovered the vessel after Solomon's death, thought it contained treasure, opened it, released the 72, placing this event around 600 BC, during the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, during the period when the Hebrew Scriptures were being compiled, during the period when an extremely important document called the Book of Enoch was being written and circulated. Enoch describes the same hierarchy. Enoch predates the New Testament by centuries. It was considered scripture by early Christian communities. It appears in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's still part of the Ethiopian Bible. And in the 4th century AD, multiple church councils excluded it from the canonical Bible. Why exclude something already considered scripture? The stated reason was uncertain authorship. The content of the book makes the real reason obvious. Enoch describes a direct transfer of forbidden knowledge from non-human entities to humans. Specific knowledge about metallurgy, about astronomy, about medicine, about the manipulation of natural forces. The same domains the Goetia specialists control: Marbas, medicine and disease; Marcosias, military strategy; Valifor, mechanical arts; Lirage, wounds and their treatment. These aren't abstract supernatural powers. They're classified technical domains. And Enoch says humanity received this knowledge from beings who weren't human. The Church excluded that document and classified the manual that names those beings as a capital offense. The suppression and the taxonomy are connected. Everything about the suppression is connected. Let's assume the most conservative interpretation. All of this is mythological framework, how ancient cultures organized knowledge they couldn't otherwise explain. That still doesn't account for the cross-cultural consistency. Pazuzu, one of the most recognizable entities in Mesopotamian literature, appears in Sumerian texts around 2000 BC. A version of the same entity appears in the Goetia under a different name. A parallel version appears in the Greek magical papyri from Roman Egypt. Another appears in early Kabbalistic texts, with similar attributes in every case. Similar names, similar domains of influence, similar ritual responses. And scholars tracking the transmission lines find the connections don't fully close. These civilizations were trading, yes. But the specific details of demonic taxonomy were not items of normal trade. They appear in parallel, in cultures that should have arrived at different mythological conclusions, which leaves two possible explanations. The first, there was a shared cultural transmission we haven't fully mapped. A chain of knowledge moving from a single source, possibly Mesopotamian, possibly older, outward into Canaan, Egypt, Greece, and eventually into Western Europe. And the second explanation is the one the Church's own behavior implies, that these entities exist independently of any human cultural framework, that multiple civilizations encountered them separately, and documented what they found. The Church's operational response, the executions, the burning, the updated exorcism protocols, supports the second interpretation. Institutions don't spend 600 years suppressing material they consider fictional. The suppression itself is the most compelling evidence that the people closest to this information, the ones with access to the Inquisition records, to the documented cases, to the Vatican archives that are still partially classified, believed they were dealing with something real. The book is available. You can read it tonight. The book is available. What isn't available, what has been systematically fragmented for centuries, is the interpretive framework. The Kabbalists have a piece. The Enochian tradition has a piece. The Sumerologists have a piece. The Vatican has the piece that explains why suppression was necessary. They don't share, because the conclusion you reach when you put those pieces together is that the entities described in the Goetia were known to every major civilization in human history, were real enough to be documented, catalogued, bound by the most powerful king in the ancient Near East, and suppressed for 6 centuries by the most powerful institution in Western history. That's not the history we were taught. No, it's the one they burned the books to prevent. The Goetia is still in print. You can read it tonight. But understanding what you're reading, that's a different question, one that's been deliberately difficult to answer for 600 years. The key word for today is Goetia. If this episode opens something you need to go deeper on, that word is your anchor. We'll see you at the next one.